Jamal Anderson sat quietly in his office, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting elongated shadows across the room. His desk, neat and orderly, was covered in documents related to the case he had been preparing for months. Jamal had always taken pride in his attention to detail, and today was no different. But despite the meticulous preparation, there was a weight hanging over him that had little to do with the case itself. It was the same weight he felt whenever he entered certain courtrooms, the weight of unspoken judgments and quiet prejudice. Jamal was one of the top defense attorneys in his city, having earned a reputation for being relentless in the pursuit of justice. His career was a testament to hard work and resilience, especially as a black lawyer navigating a system that wasn't always welcoming. He had represented clients in high-stakes cases, faced off against powerful corporations, and won more than his fair share of battles in court. But today, something felt different. Today, he would be facing not just the opposing counsel, but also a deeply entrenched bias that permeated the judicial system. His client, Marcus Green, had been accused of embezzling millions from a company owned by the Sullivan family, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the city. The Sullivans were known for their political connections, their wealth, and, more quietly, their ability to sway the legal system in their favor. Jamal knew from the start that this case wouldn't be a simple one, but what bothered him most was the judge presiding over the trial, Judge Harvey Barrett. Judge Barrett was a seasoned jurist respected in legal circles for his long career and his sharp mind, but Jamal had heard the whispers. He knew that Barrett's reputation wasn't entirely clean, especially when it came to cases involving black defendants or attorneys. The judge had a history of subtly favoring the wealthy and well-connected, and his rulings often hinted at a bias that few dared to confront openly. Jamal had appeared before Barrett once before, and had felt the sting of condescension in the judge's tone, the way his arguments were dismissed as though they were insignificant. Today, he expected more of the same. Jamal glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost time to head to the courthouse. He gathered his papers, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. This was a battle he was used to fighting, proving himself not only as a competent attorney, but as a man who deserved respect in a room full of people who were all too willing to deny him that. He had spent years perfecting the art of staying composed in the face of discrimination, never allowing the subtle racism that lingered in certain courtrooms to distract him from the task at hand. As he left his office and stepped out onto the busy street, his thoughts briefly drifted to his family. His wife, Karen, had always been his rock, supporting him through every case, every late night, and every disappointment. She had reminded him that his work was bigger than just him, that every victory he earned was a victory for those who came after him. Jamal thought of his son, Malcolm, and the world he was growing up in. It was a world where success wasn't always enough, where you had to fight twice as hard just to be seen as equal. By the time Jamal reached the courthouse, he had shifted his focus back to the case. His client's future depended on him, and that was all that mattered now. The courthouse loomed ahead, a grand building of stone and marble, symbolizing justice but often serving as a reminder of how unevenly that justice could be distributed. As he walked through the doors, the familiar hum of activity greeted him, lawyers in suits huddled together, clerks rushing from one room to another, and the low murmur of conversations about legal strategy and courtroom gossip. Jamal made his way to the courtroom where the trial was set to begin. The opposing counsel, led by a smug attorney named Patrick Sullivan, a relative of the Sullivan family, was already seated, casually chatting with his colleagues. Patrick barely glanced at Jamal as he entered, a dismissive gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Jamal ignored it, as he always did, and took his place at the defense table. The room gradually filled with spectators, reporters, and colleagues, all aware that this case was more than just another trial. It was a battle between power and principle. When Judge Barrett finally entered the courtroom, Jamal felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The judge, with his graying hair and imposing presence, took his seat, his expression neutral but his eyes carrying a familiar, quiet disdain. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Barrett said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of condescension, "I trust you are ready to proceed." Jamal nodded, his face betraying none of the frustration he felt. He knew what was coming. From the moment the trial started, Barrett would find ways to undermine his case: interruptions, dismissals, rulings that would make his job harder. But Jamal had learned long ago that in situations like these, the best weapon was composure. He couldn't afford to lose his temper or let the bias affect his performance. His client's life was on the line. As the trial began, Jamal presented his case with precision, laying out the facts clearly and methodically. His voice was steady, his argument sound, but it wasn't long before Judge Barrett began to show his true colors. The judge frequently interrupted Jamal's arguments, questioning his approach and even dismissing key pieces of evidence as irrelevant. Jamal could see the pattern emerging. The way Barrett subtly favored the prosecution, allowing them to present arguments without interruption while making it clear that he didn't take Jamal's case seriously. Despite the obstacles, Jamal pressed on, determined not to give Judge Barrett any reason to claim he was being emotional or difficult. But it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the judge had already made up his mind. The spectators exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the unfairness of the proceedings, while the opposing counsel smirked, confident in their advantage. By the end of the day, Jamal had presented most of his case, but it was clear that he was fighting an uphill battle, not just against the evidence, but against the very system that was supposed to ensure justice. As he left the courtroom that evening, Jamal knew that the real challenge was yet to come. Judge Barrett wasn't going to make this easy for him, and the road ahead would be filled with more subtle and not so subtle attempts to undermine him. But Jamal had faced adversity before, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he walked out into the cool evening air, He looked up at the courthouse, its towering pillars casting long shadows across the street. The fight for justice wasn't always fair, but it was a fight Jamal had been prepared for his entire life. And no matter what Judge Barrett threw at him in the days to come, he would be ready. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jamal Anderson entered the courthouse, his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew today would be critical for his client's case, and more importantly, it would test his own resilience. The trial was reaching a turning point, and Jamal had come prepared. He had spent the entire night combing through the evidence, refining his arguments, and preparing for the inevitable challenges he would face from Judge Barrett. The courtroom itself felt different this morning. Perhaps it was because the media had started to pay attention to the case, with a few reporters now sitting in the back rows. Or maybe it was the growing realization among the spectators that this trial was about more than just Marcus Green's guilt or innocence. It was becoming a test of fairness in the system itself, a test that everyone, Jamal included, knew was being watched closely. As Jamal took his seat at the defense table, he noticed the prosecution already in place. Patrick Sullivan sat confidently, his polished appearance matching the expensive suit he wore. The Sullivans were a family with influence, and it was clear that Patrick had been taught to expect victory. His attitude throughout the trial had been one of superiority, as if winning was a foregone conclusion. The fact that Judge Barrett had made several rulings in the prosecution's favor only reinforced Patrick's smug demeanor. Jamal, however, refused to be intimidated. He had faced opponents like Patrick before, attorneys who believed that power and wealth could bend the law to their will. But Jamal's strength lay in his ability to remain calm, to fight back with reason and logic rather than emotion. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and focused on the strategy he had laid out. Today, he would be presenting critical evidence that could shift the balance in his client's favor if, of course, Judge Barrett allowed it. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the judge entered, his presence immediately silencing the room. Judge Barrett took a seat at the bench, his expression stern but unreadable. Jamal could feel the judge's eyes on him, and it wasn't long before the subtle hints of condescension began to surface again. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Barrett said, glancing briefly at his notes before fixing his gaze on Jamal, "you may proceed with your next witness. But I would remind you to stay on point. We don't want to waste the court's time with irrelevant details." The comment was delivered with a veneer of politeness, but Jamal knew exactly what it meant. Barrett was setting the tone, reminding everyone in the room who was in control. Jamal gave a slight nod, acknowledging the judge without showing any sign of frustration. "Thank you, Your Honor," Jamal said, rising from his seat and addressing the courtroom. He knew that his every move was being scrutinized not just by the judge, but by the prosecution, the jury, and the spectators. He had to maintain his composure, no matter how unfair the proceedings seemed. Jamal called his next witness to the stand, a forensic accountant who had reviewed the financial records in question. This testimony was crucial. It would show that the funds Marcus Green had been accused of embezzling had actually been moved with the authorization of the company's CFO, a detail that the prosecution had conveniently overlooked. Jamal knew that this piece of evidence could dismantle the prosecution's narrative, but he also knew that Judge Barrett might not allow it to stand uncontested. The accountant took the stand, a professional, no-nonsense woman who had been in the field for over 20 years. Her testimony was clear, methodical, and precise. She explained the flow of money, how the transfers were documented, and how everything had been above board. But as she spoke, Jamal noticed the judge's body language, his slight frown, the way he leaned back in his chair, as if he were already bored. It was subtle, but it was there. Jamal braced himself for what was to come. When the witness finished her testimony, Jamal began to ask his follow-up questions, carefully leading her to confirm the key points that would exonerate Marcus. But before he could get too far, Judge Barrett interrupted. "Mr. Anderson," the judge said, his tone sharp, "I fail to see how this line of questioning is relevant to the charges at hand. You've made your point. Let's move on." Jamal paused, choosing his words carefully. He couldn't afford to antagonize the judge, but he also couldn't let this moment slip away. The testimony was crucial, and he needed the jury to hear every detail. "Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice calm but firm, "this testimony goes directly to the heart of the prosecution's case. The funds that my client is accused of embezzling were moved with full authorization from the company's financial officer. This is critical to proving his innocence." Judge Barrett's expression didn't change. "I understand, Mr. Anderson, but we're not here to debate accounting procedures. Unless you have something more directly tied to the charges, I suggest you move on." Jamal could feel the frustration building inside him, but he suppressed it. He had expected this. He had known from the beginning that Judge Barrett would try to undermine his case at every turn. But what bothered him most wasn't the unfairness of it. It was the fact that the jury might start to believe that his arguments were, as the judge suggested, irrelevant. Patrick Sullivan, for his part, looked completely at ease. He sat back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips as he watched Jamal struggle to keep the testimony on track. It was clear that Patrick was counting on Judge Barrett to do the heavy lifting in this case, to dismiss Jamal's arguments before they could gain any real traction. But Jamal wasn't about to back down. He had spent years perfecting the art of staying composed under pressure, and he wasn't going to let one biased judge derail his case. He nodded respectfully to the judge and turned back to the witness, carefully guiding her through the rest of her testimony without stepping too far outside the lines that Barrett had drawn. When the cross-examination began, Patrick wasted no time in trying to discredit the witness. He used his usual tactics, smug, condescending remarks designed to make the witness seem unreliable or incompetent. But the accountant held her ground, refusing to be rattled by Patrick's approach. Jamal watched closely, ready to intervene if necessary, but it became clear that Patrick's strategy wasn't working. The witness remained calm, answering each question with precision. Still, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Judge Barrett's earlier comments had set the tone, and the jury had seen the judge dismiss his arguments with barely concealed disdain. It was subtle, but in a case like this, even subtle shifts in perception could have a profound impact. As the day wore on, Jamal continued to present his case, but it became increasingly clear that Judge Barrett wasn't going to make it easy for him. Every time Jamal introduced a piece of evidence or called a witness, the judge found a way to undermine it, whether by interrupting, dismissing, or limiting the scope of the testimony. It was a slow, grinding process, and Jamal could feel the tension rising in the courtroom. The spectators, many of whom had been following the case closely, began to murmur among themselves. They could see what was happening, even if no one was saying it out loud. The bias was palpable, and it was starting to feel like the outcome had already been decided. By the afternoon, the tension reached a boiling point. Jamal had just finished questioning a key witness when Judge Barrett called for a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Jamal remained at the defense table, reviewing his notes and preparing for the next round. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. When the court reconvened, Jamal rose to present his final piece of evidence, documents that showed Marcus Green had been acting on the instructions of the CFO when the funds were transferred. This was the linchpin of his defense, the evidence that would prove his client's innocence beyond a doubt. But before Jamal could even begin to present the documents, Judge Barrett interrupted. "Mr. Anderson," the judge said, his tone stern, "I've reviewed the documents you intend to submit, and I've decided they will not be admitted into evidence." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He had expected resistance, but this was something else entirely. These documents were crucial. They were the key to his entire defense. Without them, the prosecution's case would stand unchallenged. "Your Honor," Jamal said, struggling to keep his voice steady, "these documents are directly relevant to the charges. They show that my client was acting under the direction of the company's CFO. I respectfully request that they be admitted." Judge Barrett shook his head. "The court has already made its decision, Mr. Anderson. The documents will not be admitted." Jamal felt the frustration boiling inside him. This wasn't just bias, it was sabotage. The judge was actively working to prevent him from presenting his case, and there was nothing he could do about it. If he pushed too hard, he risked being held in contempt. But if he didn't push, his client would be convicted. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "I would like to note my objection for the record, Your Honor." Noted, Judge Barrett replied, his tone dismissive. Jamal sat down, his mind racing. He had prepared for this, but the reality of it was harder to bear than he had anticipated. He had always known that the legal system was flawed, that bias and prejudice could shape the outcome of a case, but to see it unfold so blatantly in front of him, with his client's future hanging in the balance, it was almost too much to take. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jamal continued to fight, presenting what little evidence he was allowed, cross-examining witnesses, and trying to keep the jury focused on the facts. But Judge Barrett's constant interference made it nearly impossible to gain any ground. Every time Jamal made progress, the judge found a way to knock him back. By the end of the day, Jamal was exhausted. As the courtroom emptied, he gathered his things and prepared to leave, his mind already racing with plans for the next day. He knew he couldn't give up, no matter how stacked the odds were against him. His client was counting on him, and Jamal wasn't going to let him down. But as he walked out of the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. The system wasn't just biased, it was rigged. And unless something changed, Marcus Green would be found guilty, not because of the evidence, but because of who he was and who was sitting on the bench. As Jamal drove home that night, the weight of the day's events pressed down on him. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, believing that the law could be a tool for change. But today he had seen just how easily that tool could be twisted, bent to serve the interests of those in power. The conflict was far from over. Tomorrow, Jamal would return to the courtroom and continue the fight. But tonight, as he sat in the quiet of his car, he allowed himself to acknowledge the harsh truth. The system was broken, and it would take more than one trial to fix it. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. It wasn't just the usual mix of spectators, attorneys, and jurors who filled the seats. Word had spread about Jamal Anderson's case, and now the public eye was fixed on what was happening in Judge Barrett's courtroom. Reporters had crowded into the back rows, civil rights advocates whispered among themselves, and a quiet tension gripped the air, like the calm before a storm. Jamal arrived early, his mind racing with strategies. The previous day had been a disaster, and he knew that today could be even worse. Judge Barrett's blatant bias was no longer just a suspicion, it was an undeniable fact. The judge had gone out of his way to undermine Jamal's defense, and it was clear to everyone in the courtroom. But the question on everyone's mind was how far Barrett would go to push Jamal into a corner. As Jamal took his seat at the defense table, he saw Marcus Green sitting beside him, his hands nervously folded in his lap. Marcus had been through hell over the last few weeks, and it was starting to show. The once confident businessman now looked weary, beaten down by the constant pressure of the trial. Jamal knew that Marcus was counting on him, and that weighed heavily on his shoulders. "How are you holding up?" Jamal asked quietly, leaning in to speak to his client. Marcus gave a small, tight smile. "I've been better," he admitted, "but I trust you, Jamal. I know you're doing everything you can." Jamal nodded, though a part of him wondered if that would be enough. He had prepared meticulously for this trial, but no amount of preparation could change the fact that Judge Barrett was determined to see him fail, and that realization stung deeply. The courtroom doors opened, and Judge Barrett strode in, his black robe billowing behind him. He took a seat at the bench, his expression as stern as ever. There was no warmth in his eyes, no indication that today would be any different than the previous ones. Jamal could sense the hostility radiating from him, and he steeled himself for what was to come. The morning proceedings began as expected. The prosecution, led by Patrick Sullivan, continued to present their case with smug confidence. Patrick had no reason to worry. He knew that Barrett was on his side, and that Jamal's objections would be overruled at every turn. As the morning wore on, Jamal found himself repeatedly frustrated as the judge blocked key pieces of evidence, dismissed witnesses before they could finish their testimony, and scolded Jamal for wasting the court's time. But Jamal wasn't going to back down. He had come too far, and he knew that the only way to fight this injustice was to stay calm and keep pushing forward. He presented his arguments with measured confidence, never raising his voice even when Barrett made it clear that he wasn't interested in hearing what Jamal had to say. It was during the cross-examination of a crucial witness, a forensic analyst, when things took a turn for the worse. Jamal had been carefully laying the groundwork, asking the witness about the discrepancies in the financial records that the prosecution had submitted as evidence. The analyst, a seasoned expert, had already testified that some of the key documents had been altered, raising questions about their authenticity. Jamal was about to dive deeper into the analysis when Judge Barrett suddenly interrupted. "Mr. Anderson," Barrett's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife, "I've allowed you to question this witness for quite some time now, but I'm not seeing how this is relevant to the charges at hand. We are here to determine whether your client embezzled funds, not to nitpick accounting errors." Jamal froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected resistance, but this was a deliberate attempt to shut him down. The judge was making it clear that he didn't care about the evidence. He was going to push Jamal into a corner no matter what. "Your Honor," Jamal began, keeping his voice steady, "these discrepancies in the financial records are directly related to the charges. If the prosecution's evidence has been tampered with, that calls into question the integrity of their entire case." Barrett narrowed his eyes. "I disagree. The court has heard enough on this matter. I suggest you move on." Jamal clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the judge's bias bearing down on him. He couldn't let this slide, not now. He had to stand his ground, even if it meant risking the judge's wrath. "Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice firm but respectful, "I must object. This testimony is crucial to my client's defense, and it's my duty to present all relevant evidence to the jury." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The spectators sat in stunned silence, waiting to see how Barrett would respond. Jamal could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their interest piqued by the growing conflict between him and the judge. Barrett's face darkened, and for a moment, it looked as though he might explode. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice cold and menacing. "Mr. Anderson, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court. I suggest you watch your tone." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Jamal felt his heart skip a beat. Contempt of court. That was the ultimate weapon in Barrett's arsenal, the power to arrest and silence him if he stepped out of line. Jamal knew he was walking a fine line, but he also knew that he couldn't back down now. His client's life was on the line, and he couldn't afford to let the judge bully him into submission. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice calm but unwavering, "I am simply doing my job as a defense attorney. The integrity of this evidence is critical, and I believe the jury has a right to hear it." Barrett's eyes flashed with anger. "Enough," he snapped. "You've made your point. Move on, or I will hold you in contempt." Jamal felt the blood drain from his face, but he refused to let the judge see his fear. He couldn't let Barrett intimidate him, not now. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his posture and nodded. "Very well, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, his hands shaking slightly as he gathered his papers. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, and Jamal could feel the weight of the judge's gaze burning into him. Barrett was testing him, pushing him to the edge to see if he would crack, but Jamal wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of frustration and futility. Jamal continued to present his case, but every time he tried to gain traction, Barrett was there to block him. It was as if the judge was deliberately sabotaging his defense, making it impossible for Jamal to present a coherent argument. By lunchtime, Jamal was exhausted. He had never felt so powerless in a courtroom before, and the realization that the system was stacked against him was beginning to take its toll. As he sat at the defense table reviewing his notes, he noticed his colleague, Sarah, approaching him. "Jamal," she said quietly, her expression concerned, "we need to talk." Jamal glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" Sarah leaned in closer, lowering her voice so that no one else could hear. "I've been doing some digging into Judge Barrett's past. There's something you need to see." She handed him a folder, and Jamal opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside were records of previous cases that Barrett had presided over, cases where black defendants and attorneys had faced similar treatment. In each case, Barrett had ruled against them, often in ways that defied legal precedent. And there were whispers, rumors of backroom deals, of connections to powerful figures who had influenced his decisions. Jamal's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. This was more than just bias. This was corruption. Barrett wasn't just a racist judge, he was actively working to manipulate the legal system for his own gain. "This is huge," Jamal whispered, his mind racing. "If we can prove this, we can expose him." Sarah nodded. "But we have to be careful. If Barrett catches wind that we're digging into his past, he'll come after you even harder." Jamal knew she was right. This was dangerous territory, but it was also their best shot at turning the tide. If they could expose Barrett's corruption, not only could they save Marcus Green, but they could also bring down the judge himself. The rest of the afternoon was tense. Jamal continued to present his case, but the weight of what he had just learned hung over him like a dark cloud. He knew that Barrett was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up so he could pounce. But now, Jamal had a plan. He would bide his time, gather more evidence, and strike when the moment was right. As the day drew to a close, Jamal stood to make his final argument for the day. He knew that tomorrow would be critical, and he needed to leave the jury with something to think about. "Your Honor," Jamal began, his voice steady, "I understand that this trial has been long and difficult for everyone involved, but I believe that the evidence we've presented today speaks for itself. My client, Marcus Green, is an innocent man who has been wrongfully accused, and while the prosecution has tried to paint him as a criminal, the facts tell a different story." Judge Barrett watched him with cold, unblinking eyes, but Jamal didn't falter. "I asked the jury to remember that justice is not about winning or losing. It's about finding the truth. And the truth is that Marcus Green did not commit the crimes he's been accused of. I trust that you will weigh the evidence carefully and deliver a fair verdict." With that, Jamal sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done all he could for today, but he knew that the real battle was still to come. As the courtroom emptied, Jamal gathered his things and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would be another fight, but this time, he had an ace up his sleeve. Judge Barrett thought he could crush Jamal under the weight of his authority, but he was about to learn that Jamal wasn't going down without a fight. As Jamal walked out of the courthouse, the evening sun casting long shadows across the steps, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The system might be broken, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had the truth on his side, and he was going to use it to take down Barrett, no matter the cost. The courtroom felt quieter than usual the next morning, as if the tension from the previous day still lingered in the air, refusing to dissipate. Jamal Anderson sat at the defense table, flipping through his notes, but his mind wasn't focused on the pages in front of him. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the folder Sarah had handed him, the one filled with evidence that could expose Judge Harvey Barrett's corruption. What he'd uncovered had been shocking, but it also filled him with a renewed sense of determination. There was more at play here than just one biased judge and one unjust trial. This went deeper, much deeper. Jamal had stayed up late the night before, going over the documents, piecing together the pattern of Judge Barrett's actions over the years. The cases, the rulings, the connections, it all pointed to a judge who had been working behind the scenes for far too long, protected by his influence and the power of his position. But now, Jamal had the opportunity to do something about it. He just had to be careful, strategic. As the courtroom began to fill with the usual crowd of lawyers, jurors, and spectators, Jamal exchanged a brief glance with Sarah. She was seated in the back, looking as focused and determined as ever. They hadn't spoken much since yesterday, but they didn't need to. Sarah knew what was at stake, and she had already started digging further into Judge Barrett's history. The trial resumed, but Jamal's mind was still partially elsewhere. His cross-examinations were sharp, his objections well-timed, but he was playing a long game now. The prosecution continued to present their case, confident as always, but Jamal noticed something different in Judge Barrett's demeanor. Barrett was watching him more closely, as though he sensed that Jamal was onto something. It wasn't just the usual animosity anymore, it was wariness. The judge knew that Jamal had found something, and he didn't like it. Midway through the day's proceedings, something unexpected happened. As Jamal was questioning the financial analyst, trying to poke holes in the prosecution's evidence, Judge Barrett cut him off. "Mr. Anderson," Barrett said, his voice colder than usual, "I think we've heard enough of this line of questioning. You're wasting the court's time." Jamal stood his ground. "Your Honor, this testimony is crucial to the defense. The prosecution's evidence relies on these financial records, and the discrepancies need to be explored fully." Judge Barrett leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I've already ruled on this, Mr. Anderson. Move on, or I'll be forced to take action." The threat was clear, and it hung heavy in the air. Jamal knew that Barrett was trying to silence him, to push him out of the case before he could go any further. But this time, Jamal wasn't backing down. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe the jury has a right to hear the full story. This evidence goes to the heart of the prosecution's case, and I intend to present it." The tension in the room was palpable. The jurors were paying close attention now, sensing the conflict between Jamal and the judge. The prosecution's team shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even some of the spectators leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. For a long moment, Judge Barrett said nothing. He simply stared at Jamal, his expression unreadable. Then, Slowly, he leaned back in his chair. "Very well," Barrett said, his voice cold. "Proceed, Mr. Anderson, but be careful." It was a warning, not just a legal one, but a personal one. Jamal knew that Barrett was watching his every move, waiting for an opportunity to strike, but he had come too far to back down now. The rest of the day passed in a blur of testimony and arguments. Jamal presented his case with precision, but his mind was constantly working on the larger picture. He knew that Barrett was corrupt, and now it was a matter of proving it. Later that evening, as Jamal was preparing to leave the courthouse, Sarah caught up with him outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the steps of the building. "I've got something," Sarah said, her voice low but urgent. Jamal turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Sarah glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before handing him another folder. "I found more cases, ones that Barrett ruled on over the years. But this isn't just about racial bias. He's been making deals with certain lawyers, offering favorable rulings in exchange for kickbacks. I even found evidence that he's been working with some influential families, ones with deep political ties." Jamal's heart raced as he opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. This was bigger than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about Barrett's prejudice, it was about corruption at the highest levels of the legal system. "This could be it," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we need to take him down." Sarah nodded. "But we have to be smart about it. If Barrett catches wind that we're digging into this, he'll come after you even harder. And we can't just rely on this alone. We need to find someone on the inside, someone who's willing to testify." Jamal thought for a moment, his mind racing. There was one person who might be able to help, a former colleague of Barrett's, a white attorney named David Collins. David had worked with Barrett for years before leaving the firm, and there had always been rumors that he knew things about the judge's dealings. If anyone could provide inside information, it would be him. "I'll talk to David," Jamal said, closing the folder. "What if we can get him to testify? We'll have enough to blow this wide open." The next day, Jamal made contact with David Collins. The two met in a small, nondescript cafe far from the courthouse and the prying eyes of the legal world. David looked nervous, glancing around as if he expected someone to be watching them. "Why are you bringing this up now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't worked with Barrett in years. You're talking about something that could destroy people's careers, mine included." Jamal leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because this isn't just about careers, David, it's about justice. Barrett's been corrupt for years, and we both know it. But now I have evidence that could expose everything. I need you to testify." David hesitated, clearly torn. "You don't understand how deep this goes. Barrett isn't just some corrupt judge. He has connections, powerful ones. If you go after him, they'll come after you too." Jamal nodded. "I know, but I'm not backing down. This is bigger than just one case. David, if we don't stop him, he'll keep doing this, ruining lives and getting away with it." For a long moment, David was silent. He looked down at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "All right," David said quietly. "I'll do it, but we have to be careful. If Barrett finds out that I'm involved, it could get ugly." Jamal felt a surge of relief, but he knew that this was just the beginning. With David's testimony and the evidence Sarah had uncovered, they had a chance to take down Barrett once and for all, but they would have to be careful, and they would have to act fast. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jamal and Sarah worked tirelessly, piecing together their case, gathering more evidence, and preparing for the battle ahead. Jamal knew that Barrett wouldn't go down without a fight, and he was right. As the trial continued, Judge Barrett became even more aggressive. He blocked Jamal's motions, overruled his objections, and did everything in his power to make sure the defense struggled. But Jamal didn't let it shake him. He knew that soon the tide would turn. Finally, the day came when David Collins took the stand. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and even more spectators eager to see what would happen. David's testimony was explosive. He detailed years of corruption, backroom deals, and unethical rulings, all orchestrated by Judge Barrett. As David spoke, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Even the jurors, who had been growing increasingly skeptical of Barrett's behavior, seemed shocked by what they were hearing. Barrett, for his part, remained expressionless, but Jamal could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. By the time David finished his testimony, the damage had been done. Barrett's carefully crafted facade had been shattered, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. As the trial continued, Jamal's defense grew stronger. The prosecution's case began to unravel, and Barrett's influence started to crumble. With David's testimony and the evidence Sarah had uncovered, Jamal had exposed the judge for what he truly was, a corrupt, prejudiced man who had been using the legal system for his own gain. But Jamal knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet. He still had to win the case for Marcus Green, and he still had to make sure that Barrett faced justice for his actions. As the trial drew to a close, Jamal stood before the jury one last time. He knew that the outcome of the trial would depend on more than just the facts. It would depend on whether the jury believed in the integrity of the legal system. The law is supposed to protect all of us, Jamal said, his voice steady but powerful. But when those entrusted with upholding the law abuse their power, it's up to us to stand up and demand justice. Judge Barrett betrayed the very principles he swore to uphold, and today, we have the chance to right that wrong. With those final words, Jamal sat down, knowing that the fate of the case and of Judge Barrett was now in the hands of the jury. The courtroom had fallen into a strange, tense quiet after David Collins' explosive testimony. Judge Harvey Barrett, who had once wielded absolute control over the room, now sat frozen at the bench. His confident facade had cracked. The once imposing figure now appeared smaller, weighed down by the weight of his unraveling reputation. Jamal Anderson could feel the shift in the air. The courtroom was no longer Barrett's to command. For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt a flicker of hope that justice might prevail. But he knew better than to get too comfortable. There was still a long road ahead. After the shocking revelations from David's testimony, the courtroom was adjourned for the day. Jamal left the courthouse to a swarm of reporters eager to capture every word. Flashes from cameras bombarded him as questions were thrown his way from all directions. Mr. Anderson, do you believe Judge Barrett will be removed from the case? How do you feel about the allegations of corruption? Do you think this case could lead to broader changes in the justice system? Jamal kept his responses brief and focused, giving nothing away. I believe in the truth, and I believe in justice. That's what this case is about, and we'll let the evidence speak for itself. Sarah, who had been standing next to him, pulled him away from the crowd. Let's get out of here before this turns into a media circus, she muttered. They headed back to the office, where they immediately began preparing for the next steps. The fallout from David's testimony was huge, but it wasn't enough to win the case. They still had to prove that Barrett's rulings were unjust, and that would take more than just one man's testimony. Late that evening, Jamal sat in his office, reviewing documents in the dim light of his desk lamp. He rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the exhaustion weighing on him. The evidence they had was damning, but Barrett's power and influence still ran deep. He had friends in high places, people who wouldn't want to see him fall. Sarah entered the office, carrying a fresh stack of files. I've been going through more of Barrett's past cases, she said, setting the files down on the desk. There's a pattern here, especially in cases involving black defendants or attorneys, but it's subtle. He's careful not to leave too much of a trail. Jamal nodded, flipping through the files. He's been playing this game for a long time. We need something concrete, something undeniable if we're going to bring him down for good. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. There's one more thing we haven't considered. Jamal looked up, his brow furrowed. What is it? She took a deep breath. We could reopen Marcus Green's case. With everything that's come to light about Barrett, we have grounds to challenge the original ruling. We can argue that Barrett's bias directly affected the outcome of the trial. Jamal sat back in his chair, considering her words. Reopening the case would be a bold move, one that could completely change the trajectory of everything. It would mean dragging Marcus Green back into the courtroom, forcing him to relive the worst moments of his life. But at the same time, it could be the key to exposing Barrett's full extent of corruption. I don't know if Marcus is ready for that, Jamal said, his voice heavy with concern. He's already been through so much. Sarah nodded. I understand. But if we want to take Barrett down, we need to show that his bias had real, tangible consequences. And Marcus's case is the perfect example. Barrett threw out critical evidence that could have exonerated him, all because of his own prejudice. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. We'll need Marcus's consent before we move forward. The next morning, Jamal met with Marcus at a small cafe, away from the prying eyes of the press. Marcus looked tired, worn down by the stress of the trial and the public attention. His usual bright smile was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. What's going on? Marcus asked, his voice laced with fatigue. I've been following the case, and it seems like things are getting worse. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Marcus, I need to talk to you about something important. With everything that's come to light about Judge Barrett, his bias, the corruption, it's clear that his rulings were influenced by his prejudice. Sarah and I have been looking into his past cases, and there's a clear pattern. Marcus's eyes narrowed, sensing where the conversation was headed. And you want to reopen my case, don't you? Jamal hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yes, I think we have a real shot at getting your conviction overturned, Marcus, but I won't lie to you, this is going to be hard. It means going back into court, reliving everything, and there's no guarantee that we'll win. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He was silent for a long time, staring out the window as the weight of the decision settled over him. I just want this to be over, man, Marcus said quietly. I've been fighting for so long. I don't know if I have it in me to go through it all again. Jamal understood his hesitation. Marcus had already been through so much, and reopening the case would mean dredging up painful memories, but at the same time, it was a chance at redemption, a chance to finally clear his name. I won't pressure you, Marcus, Jamal said softly. This is your decision, but if you're willing to fight one more time, I believe we can win. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, Jamal, let's do it. I'm tired of running. If this is what it takes to get my life back, then I'll fight. With Marcus's consent, Jamal and Sarah immediately got to work. They filed a motion to reopen the case, citing new evidence of judicial bias and corruption. The motion quickly gained attention, drawing even more media scrutiny to the already high-profile case. Civil rights groups rallied behind Jamal and Marcus, seeing the case as a symbol of a larger fight against systemic racism in the legal system. The judge assigned to review the motion was Judge Catherine Rivera, known for her fairness and commitment to justice. She was a stark contrast to Judge Barrett, impartial, principled, and not easily swayed by outside influence. At the hearing to decide whether the case would be reopened, Judge Rivera listened intently as Jamal presented the evidence of Barrett's bias. He detailed the pattern of rulings, the suppressed documents, and the testimony from David Collins. The courtroom was tense as Jamal laid out his case, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. Judge Rivera sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything. Then she looked up at Jamal, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice calm but firm, "the evidence you've presented is compelling. Judge Barrett's conduct is deeply troubling, and if what you've uncovered is true, it raises serious questions about the integrity of his rulings." Jamal held his breath, waiting for her decision. "I'm granting the motion to reopen the case," Judge Rivera said, her voice ringing with authority. "This court will hear the evidence of judicial bias, and we will ensure that justice is served." The courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispers and murmurs as the decision sank in. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. As they left the courthouse, Sarah turned to Jamal, a small smile on her face. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Jamal nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next step. Reopening the case was a victory, but now they had to prove that Barrett's bias had directly impacted Marcus's trial. It wouldn't be easy, but with the evidence they had gathered and the support of the legal community, Jamal knew they had a fighting chance. The days leading up to the new trial were a blur of preparation. Jamal and Sarah worked around the clock, reviewing every piece of evidence, every ruling, every detail that could strengthen their case. Marcus, though exhausted, remained committed, ready to face whatever came next. The trial began under the scrutiny of the national media. News outlets from across the country covered the proceedings, framing it as a landmark case in the fight against judicial corruption and racial bias. Civil rights activists filled the courtroom, and the public watched with bated breath as Jamal stood before the court, ready to present the case that would challenge the very foundations of the justice system. Jamal's opening statement was clear and powerful. "This isn't just about Marcus Green," he told the jury. "This is about the integrity of our legal system. It's about whether we can trust those who hold the power to decide the fate of others. Judge Barrett abused that power, and today, we will prove it." The prosecution, still trying to defend the original ruling, argued that there was no clear evidence of bias in Marcus's trial. They claimed that Barrett's rulings were within legal bounds and that reopening the case was unnecessary. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the weight of evidence was against them. Jamal called witness after witness, each one further exposing the web of corruption that had allowed Barrett to operate unchecked for so long. David Collins testified again, this time in even greater detail, painting a damning picture of the judge's history of bias and unethical behavior. Finally, the day came for Marcus to testify. As he took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke with quiet dignity, recounting the events of his trial and the impact that Barrett's bias had on his life. His testimony was raw and emotional, and it resonated deeply with the jury. As the trial came to a close, Jamal delivered his closing argument with the same passion and clarity that had defined his career. "We are all entitled to justice," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But when those entrusted with upholding the law allow their biases to influence their decisions, they betray that sacred trust. Today, we have the chance to correct that betrayal. We have the chance to make things right." The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom thick as everyone waited for the verdict. When they finally returned, the air was heavy with anticipation. The jury foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide the outcome. The room was so silent that Jamal could hear the rustle of the paper as it was unfolded. "We find that the original trial was tainted by judicial bias," the foreman said, his voice clear. "The conviction of Marcus Green is overturned." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a wave of applause and cheers. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly, buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed with emotion. Jamal felt a surge of relief and pride as he embraced Marcus, knowing that they had fought for something bigger than just one man's freedom. They had fought for justice, for integrity, and for the countless others who had been denied their fair chance. As they left the courthouse that day, the weight of the victory hung heavy in the air. But Jamal knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight against systemic racism and corruption in the legal system was far from over, but today, they had taken a significant step forward. And as they walked out into the sunlight, Jamal couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long time, justice had finally been served. The courthouse was a flurry of activity on the day of the appeal trial. The building, which had seen countless cases come and go, now stood as the battleground for one of the most pivotal legal confrontations in recent memory. Jamal Anderson, who had fought tooth and nail to bring this case to light, was preparing for the showdown that could finally expose the depth of Judge Barrett's corruption. Jamal arrived early that morning, his suit freshly pressed, but his mind was heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Today, it wasn't just Marcus Green's case that would be at stake, it was the integrity of the entire judicial system. Jamal knew that this trial wasn't just about clearing Marcus's name or even about vindicating his own efforts after being wrongfully accused of contempt. This was about dismantling the power that people like Barrett had wielded for far too long. Sarah met Jamal outside the courthouse. Her expression was tense, but her eyes showed determination. She had been by his side through every step of this grueling journey, and today was no different. "Ready?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jamal nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be. Today we lay everything on the table." As they walked through the courthouse doors, they were greeted by a sea of reporters and cameras. The media had turned this case into a national spectacle, a symbol of the fight against systemic racism and corruption. Civil rights groups had rallied around Jamal and Marcus, and the public was eager to see justice served. Once inside the courtroom, Jamal took his seat at the defense table. He glanced around, noting the presence of some of the most influential figures in the legal community. It wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a referendum on everything that Judge Barrett represented. When Judge Catherine Rivera entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. Rivera, who had earned a reputation for fairness and integrity, was the exact opposite of Barrett. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her commitment to upholding the law without bias. Today, she would oversee the appeal, and Jamal was confident that she would give both sides a fair hearing. The prosecution, representing the state, opened with a weak defense of the original trial. They argued that Barrett's rulings, while perhaps strict, were within the bounds of judicial discretion. They attempted to downplay the evidence of bias, suggesting that Jamal's team was reading too much into Barrett's actions. But their arguments lacked conviction, and it was clear that they were scrambling to defend a crumbling case. Then it was Jamal's turn. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him, as he prepared to deliver what might be the most important argument of his career. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, today we stand at a crossroads," Jamal began, his voice calm but resolute. "This case isn't just about Marcus Green, it's about the principles of justice and fairness that form the foundation of our legal system. It's about whether we can trust those who hold the power to decide the fate of others." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We've uncovered evidence of a pattern of bias of rulings that have disproportionately harmed black defendants and attorneys," Jamal continued. "Judge Barrett has operated with impunity for years, using his position to manipulate outcomes based on his personal prejudices rather than the facts of the case. Today, we're here to shine a light on that corruption, to expose the truth, and to restore faith in our system." Jamal then methodically presented the evidence. He showed the jury and Judge Rivera the pattern of Barrett's rulings, the suppressed documents, and the testimony from David Collins. Every piece of evidence pointed to a man who had abused his power for decades, a man who had tainted the lives of countless people with his bias. As he spoke, Jamal could see the impact his words were having. The jury members were leaning forward in their seats, fully engaged. Even Judge Rivera's expression, usually impassive, showed signs of concern as she listened intently to the details of Barrett's misconduct. Jamal's voice rose slightly as he reached the crux of his argument. Judge Barrett's actions weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing when he dismissed key evidence in Marcus Green's trial. He knew exactly what he was doing when he silenced objections from black attorneys in his courtroom. This isn't about one bad decision. It's about a pattern of behavior that has denied justice to those who deserve it. He turned to the jury, his eyes locking with theirs. "Today, you have the power to change that. You have the power to send a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Jamal's closing statement echoed through the courtroom like a battle cry. He could feel the shift in the air, the energy of the room rising as the gravity of what was at stake became clear to everyone present. This was no longer just about a single case, it was about the future of the justice system itself. When Jamal sat down, Sarah gave him a nod of encouragement. "That was powerful," she whispered. "You've got them." But Jamal knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Judge Barrett was scheduled to testify later that day, and it would be his opportunity to defend himself. Jamal wasn't sure what to expect. Barrett was a seasoned judge, used to holding his own in court, but he also knew that the evidence against Barrett was overwhelming. After a short recess, the courtroom reconvened for Barrett's testimony. The former judge entered the room with a sense of quiet arrogance, his eyes cold and calculating. Despite everything, he still carried himself like a man who believed he could talk his way out of any situation. Barrett took the stand, his lawyer by his side, and began his defense. He spoke in a measured tone, carefully choosing his words as he tried to explain away the accusations. He claimed that his rulings had always been based on legal precedent and that any perception of bias was unfounded. But as Barrett spoke, it became clear that his defense was crumbling. The more he tried to justify his actions, the more desperate he seemed. His usual confidence was slipping, and for the first time, Jamal saw something close to fear in the man's eyes. Jamal watched Barrett closely, waiting for the moment he knew was coming. And then it happened. The prosecution called their star witness, the former colleague who had come forward with inside information about Barrett's racial biases. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the witness took the stand. The white attorney, visibly nervous but determined, began to recount his experiences working with Barrett. He detailed how Barrett had made offhand remarks about black defendants, how he had instructed his staff to handle cases involving black attorneys with extra scrutiny, and how he had manipulated evidence in certain cases to favor the prosecution. The revelation hit Barrett like a ton of bricks. His face, once smug and self-assured, now twisted with panic. He tried to interrupt, tried to refute the testimony, but the damage was done. The truth was out. As the witness continued, Barrett's lawyer attempted to discredit him, suggesting that he had an ulterior motive for coming forward, but the jury could see through the trade. The testimony was too detailed, too damning to be ignored. By the time the witness stepped down, Barrett's defense was in shambles. The former judge sat at the defense table, his head in his hands, knowing that his career and his freedom was slipping away. Jamal stood once more to deliver his final argument. He didn't need to say much, the evidence had already spoken for itself, but he wanted to leave the jury with a clear message. "We trust our judges to be impartial, to uphold the law without bias," Jamal said, his voice steady. But Judge Barrett betrayed that trust. He used his position to harm the very people he was supposed to protect. "Today, we have the opportunity to correct that wrong." He turned to the jury. "You have the power to restore justice, to ensure that no one, no matter how powerful, can abuse their position for personal gain. I ask you to do what's right." The jury deliberated for hours, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jamal and Sarah waited anxiously, knowing that the outcome of this trial would have far-reaching consequences. Finally, the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the foreman stood and read the decision. "We find that Judge Harvey Barrett's actions were motivated by racial bias and that his rulings were influenced by his personal prejudices. We recommend that he be stripped of his judicial position and charged with corruption." The courtroom erupted in gasps, followed by applause from the civil rights activists and supporters who had gathered to witness the trial. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. Barrett's reign of injustice was finally over. As Barrett was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his once commanding presence reduced to a broken man, Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Justice had been served, not just for Marcus Green, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Outside the courthouse, Jamal was met with cheers from the crowd. Reporters pushed forward, eager to get his reaction, but Jamal simply smiled and shook his head. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about justice. And today, justice was served." He turned to Sarah, who stood by his side, her face filled with pride. Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, knowing that while this battle was won, the fight for true equality was far from over. And as they disappeared into the crowd, Jamal couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long time, the scales of justice had finally tipped in the right direction. As the final verdict echoed through the courtroom, Jamal Anderson sat still in his seat for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. The long, grueling battle for justice had finally culminated in a verdict that not only cleared Marcus Green's name but exposed the deep-seated corruption of Judge Harvey Barrett. The emotions that surged through Jamal were a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a quiet sense of triumph. Justice had been served, but the road to get here had been anything but smooth. Judge Catherine Rivera, known for her unflinching fairness, remained composed as she gave her closing remarks. "This court recognizes that today marks a pivotal moment in our pursuit of justice. The actions uncovered here represent a grave betrayal of the legal system and of the trust placed in those sworn to uphold the law. Let this case serve as a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability." Court adjourned.
With the sound of her gavel, the courtroom became a flurry of activity. Reporters rushed to capture statements, families exchanged relieved hugs, and the sound of Barrett being escorted away in handcuffs carried through the air like a symbol of victory. But amid the chaos, Jamal remained seated, his mind drifting through the events of the past few months. He had won, but it was not without a cost.
Sarah placed her hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the pride and relief she felt for him. "You brought him down." And Jamal looked up at her, his lips curling into a small, tired smile. "We did it," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done this without you, or the team, or everyone who stood by us when it felt like the world was against us." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds had gathered to support Jamal, Marcus, and the case that had come to symbolize the fight against systemic racism within the legal system. Activists, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens had rallied behind them, turning a once quiet trial into a national movement for change. Jamal could hear the distant chants of the crowd: "Justice for Marcus, justice for all." As he made his way to the courthouse steps, Jamal was greeted by a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. The press had been relentless in their coverage of the case, and now they were eager to hear Jamal's thoughts on the verdict. "Mr. Anderson," a reporter called, pushing through the throng of people. "What do you have to say about the verdict today? How does it feel to finally have justice for your client?" Jamal paused at the top of the courthouse steps, his hand still resting on the railing. He glanced back at Marcus, who stood just behind him, free at last after months of uncertainty and fear. Then, Jamal turned back to the crowd, his voice calm and steady. "Today's verdict is not just a victory for Marcus Green," Jamal began, his words cutting through the hum of voices. "It's a victory for everyone who has ever been wrongfully judged, everyone who has ever had to fight against a system that wasn't designed to protect them. Judge Barrett's downfall is not just the end of his career, it's the beginning of a much-needed reckoning within our justice system." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces filled with hope and anticipation. Jamal could feel the weight of their expectations resting on his shoulders. But he knew that this moment wasn't just about him or the case. It was about something much bigger, something that transcended the walls of the courthouse. The truth is, Jamal continued, our legal system is supposed to be impartial, fair, and just. But we've seen time and time again how bias, whether it's based on race, class, or status, has the power to corrupt that system. What happened in Judge Barrett's courtroom is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, one that we have to continue to fight against every single day. He glanced over at Sarah, whose supportive presence had been a lifeline through the darkest parts of this ordeal. She nodded at him, silently encouraging him to keep going. But today, Jamal said, we take a step forward. We've exposed corruption, we've stood up to injustice, and we've sent a message that we won't be silenced. The fight isn't over, but this is proof that when we stand together, when we refuse to back down, change is possible. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices blending into one powerful roar. Jamal felt a surge of emotion wash over him. He had fought battles in the courtroom before, but this one felt different. It felt like the beginning of something far greater than any single case. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, Jamal, he said quietly, so only Jamal could hear. You saved my life. Jamal shook his head. You fought for yourself too, Marcus. This was never just about one person. It's about all of us. The two men shared a quiet moment of understanding before the crowd began to press forward, eager to congratulate and speak with Jamal, but amid the noise and celebration, Jamal's mind drifted to the days ahead. The legal fight was over, but the work was just beginning. As the day wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Jamal and Sarah retreated to his office. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of the trial. Boxes of case files were stacked in every corner, each representing the hundreds of hours they had spent preparing for this moment. But now that the trial was over, Jamal felt a strange sense of emptiness. The adrenaline that had kept him going for so long had faded, leaving him with the realization that his life's mission was far from over. Sarah sat across from him, sipping a cup of coffee. So what's next, she asked, her tone light but knowing. She had been with Jamal long enough to understand that he wasn't the type to rest on his laurels. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. I've been thinking about that, he said, his voice thoughtful. The case with Barrett, it's a victory, no doubt, but it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Sarah nodded. There's more corruption out there, more judges like Barrett, more people who've been wronged by the system. Exactly, Jamal agreed. Barrett was just the tip of the iceberg. There are more people like him working behind the scenes, manipulating outcomes, stacking the deck against people who don't have the resources to fight back. We've uncovered something huge, but there's still so much more to do. Sarah set her coffee down, leaning forward with interest. You think there's a network? Jamal sighed, running a hand over his face. I don't know for sure. But what we found in Barrett's records, it doesn't feel isolated. The more we dug, the more we found connections, other judges, other lawyers, people with influence who've been working together to ensure that certain cases go a certain way. It's all about control, power, and keeping people like us in check. So what's the plan, Sarah asked, her voice steady but laced with excitement. We take them down one by one. Jamal smiled at her enthusiasm, but he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. It's going to take time. We can't go in guns blazing. We need more evidence, more testimony, more people willing to come forward. What happened with David Collins was a huge break, but we need more allies like him. We need to build a case so airtight that no one can deny what's happening. Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing for the challenge. I'm with you, whatever it takes. For the next few days, Jamal found himself inundated with offers from prestigious law firms and law schools. His success in the Barrett case had catapulted him into the national spotlight, and now everyone wanted a piece of the man who had brought down a corrupt judge. But while the offers were tempting, Jamal knew they weren't what he truly wanted. His mission had always been about more than just personal success. It was about fighting for justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One afternoon, Jamal sat in his office, reviewing yet another offer, this one from a well-known firm in New York. They were offering him a partnership with a salary that dwarfed anything he had ever earned. But as he read through the proposal, Jamal couldn't help but feel a disconnect. This wasn't who he was. This wasn't why he had become a lawyer in the first place. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. Did you see the news? Jamal frowned, quickly switching on his television. The screen flickered to life, revealing a news anchor discussing the fallout from the Barrett case. In the wake of Judge Harvey Barrett's conviction, several other judges and legal professionals have come under scrutiny for their involvement in similar cases. Investigations are underway to determine whether a larger network of corruption exists within the legal system. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. This was the confirmation he had been waiting for. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Did you see it?" he asked as soon as she picked up. "I saw it," she replied, her voice buzzing with excitement. "This is huge, Jamal. If they reinvestigating more people, it means we're not alone in this. We have allies we didn't even know about." Jamal nodded, already feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the start of a new case. "We need to move fast. We need to gather as much evidence as we can before anyone has a chance to cover their tracks." "I'm on it," Sarah said. "I'll start making calls, see what else we can dig up." As Jamal hung up, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose coursing through him once more. The Barrett case had been a victory, but it was clear now that there were more battles to be fought. The network of corruption they had uncovered was deeper and more widespread than he had initially thought. And if they wanted to take it down, they would need to be strategic, methodical, and relentless. But Jamal was ready. He had always known that the fight for justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And now, with Barrett's downfall as a catalyst, he was more determined than ever to keep running, to keep pushing forward until the system that had wronged so many was finally held accountable. As the sun set outside his office window, casting long shadows across the city, Jamal leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. The resolution of the Barrett case had been hard-won, but it was only the beginning. The real work was just beginning. Jamal Anderson had barely had time to catch his breath after the conclusion of the Kano Barrett case. The media storm had only just begun to calm, and the courthouse seemed quieter than it had in months, but the peace was short-lived. As the headlines faded and life began to return to some semblance of normalcy, Jamal couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something bigger lay beneath the surface. Judge Barrett's corruption was obvious, his bias undeniable, but there were signs that Barrett hadn't acted alone. If the evidence they'd uncovered during the trial had taught him anything, it was that Barrett was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. It all started with a phone call. Jamal had been sitting in his office late one evening, reviewing new casework and going over plans with Sarah, when his phone buzzed. The caller ID was unknown, but something told him to answer. On the other end of the line was a nervous voice, one he didn't recognize. "Mr. Anderson," the voice asked, hesitant. I don't know if you'll remember me, but I need to talk to you. It's important. It's about Barrett and others like him." And Jamal sat up straight in his chair. His instincts immediately kicked in, sensing the gravity of what this call could mean. "Who is this?" he asked cautiously, already scanning his mind for possibilities. Was it a former colleague? A witness? Someone involved in the case? "I can't say over the phone," the voice replied, clearly jittery, "but I need to meet with you. There's more you don't know. More people involved. I can't keep quiet anymore." Jamal's pulse quickened. He had been waiting for this moment, for someone to confirm what he had suspected all along. Barrett's corruption hadn't been an isolated incident. There had to be more. He quickly jotted down an address the caller gave him, noting it was a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. "All right," Jamal said. "I'll be there. Tomorrow at noon." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jamal staring at the phone in his hand. His mind raced with questions. Who was this mysterious informant? And why had they chosen now to come forward? More importantly, what did they know about the larger network of corruption that Jamal had only begun to glimpse? Sarah, who had been sitting across from Jamal, raised an eyebrow at his suddenly tense demeanor. What was that about? Jamal looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "We might have just found a lead. Someone connected to Barrett and others. They want to meet." Sarah leaned forward, her expression a mixture of excitement and caution. "You think it's legit?" Jamal shrugged, but his gut told him it was. "I don't know, but I'm not willing to ignore it. If there are more people involved, we need to know who they are." The next day, Jamal arrived at the cafe early, scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. It was a quiet, unassuming place, the kind of spot where people could meet without drawing attention. As he sat at a corner table, sipping his coffee and watching the door, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Whoever this person was, they held the key to something much bigger than Barrett's downfall. 15 minutes later, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was in his late 40s, with a tired, weathered face and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He spotted Jamal almost immediately and made his way over, sitting down across from him without a word. Jamal sized him up, noting the man's anxious energy. He clearly wasn't used to this kind of situation. "You're the one who called me," Jamal said, keeping his voice low. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "David Collins," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to work with Barrett. I saw things that weren't right." Jamal's interest peaked. "What kind of things?" Collins took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Barrett wasn't the only one. There's more other judges, lawyers, even politicians. They're all in on it. They've been rigging cases, taking bribes, and making sure certain people get off while others, people like your client, get the worst of it." Jamal's heart raced. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "And you have proof of this?" he asked, leaning in slightly. Collins nodded, his hands trembling. "I've got documents, emails, bank transfers, all of it, but I need protection. If they find out I'm talking to you, I'm dead." Jamal's mind whirred as he processed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about Barrett anymore. This was about systemic corruption at the highest levels. If what Collins said was true, they were about to blow the lid off a conspiracy that could shake the legal system to its core. "You'll have protection," Jamal assured him, though he knew the road ahead would be dangerous. "But I need you to give me everything you have. We need to move quickly before anyone can cover their tracks." Collins hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. He slid it across the table, his eyes filled with fear. "Everything's on there. I just hope it's enough." Jamal took the flash drive, his hand trembling slightly as he pocketed it. "It's a start," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." As Collins left the cafe, Jamal sat back in his chair, the weight of the flash drive pressing against him like a physical burden. He knew that what he held in his hand could be the key to exposing an entire network of corruption. But with that knowledge came danger. Powerful people wouldn't go down without a fight, and Jamal had just stepped into a much bigger battlefield. That evening, back at his office, Jamal and Sarah began to sift through the files on the flash drive. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Collins hadn't been exaggerating. There were judges, lawyers, and even high-ranking officials listed in the documents. The corruption ran deep, with cases being manipulated, evidence tampered with, and lives destroyed for the sake of money and power. This is huge, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she scrolled through the damning evidence. If we go public with this, they'll come after us, Jamal finished, his tone grim. But we can't just sit on this. People need to know. Over the next few days, Jamal and Sarah worked tirelessly to verify the information. They reached out to trusted contacts, building a case that would hold up under the inevitable scrutiny. The deeper they dug, the more connections they found, names they recognized from previous cases, judges who had ruled unfairly, and attorneys who had been complicit in covering up the truth. It wasn't long before whispers of their investigation began to spread. People were starting to ask questions, and Jamal knew it was only a matter of time before those involved in the conspiracy realized they were being exposed. One night, as Jamal and Sarah were working late in the office, the phone rang. Jamal answered it, expecting another contact with more information, but what he heard on the other end made his blood run cold. If you know what's good for you, Anderson, a deep voice growled, you'll drop this investigation, walk away, or you'll regret it. The call ended abruptly, leaving Jamal staring at the receiver in stunned silence. He had known there would be risks, but hearing a direct threat made it all too real. Who was that? Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. Jamal set the phone down slowly, his jaw clenched. Someone who doesn't want us digging any deeper. Sarah frowned, clearly shaken. What are we going to do? Jamal's expression hardened. We're going to keep going. We can't stop now. They're scared, that means we're onto something. The threats only seemed to galvanize Jamal's resolve. He wasn't about to let a shadowy network of corrupt officials intimidate him into silence. If anything, the phone call had confirmed that they were on the right track. But the danger was real, and Jamal knew they needed to be smart. He and Sarah reached out to trusted allies in the legal community and the media, ensuring that the information they had gathered would be safe if anything happened to them. They worked tirelessly to build a case that would be impossible to ignore. As the days passed, the tension grew. Jamal and Sarah both knew they were walking a fine line, but they couldn't back down. The more they uncovered, the more determined they became to see justice served. Finally, after weeks of painstaking work, they were ready. Jamal had compiled enough evidence to expose the conspiracy in full. It was time to go public. With the help of a trusted journalist, Jamal and Sarah arranged for a press conference. The media had already been buzzing with rumors of a larger conspiracy, and the anticipation was palpable. Reporters from all the major networks gathered, eager to hear what Jamal had to say. Standing before the cameras, Jamal felt a surge of adrenaline. He had faced down corruption before, but this was different. This time, the stakes were higher than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamal began, his voice steady. Despite the gravity of the moment, what we uncovered in the Barrett case was only the beginning. Today, we're here to expose a network of corruption that reaches far beyond one judge or one courtroom. As he laid out the evidence, detailing the connections between judges, lawyers, and officials who had conspired to rig the legal system, the room fell silent. The reporters listened intently, scribbling notes as Jamal revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted into a flurry of questions. Jamal answered each one calmly. Knowing that this was only the beginning, the fight for justice wasn't over, but with this revelation, they had taken a critical step forward. As the press conference came to an end, Jamal felt a sense of relief mixed with anticipation. The conspiracy had been exposed, but the battle was far from won. There would be investigations, trials, and no doubt more threats. But Jamal was ready for whatever came next. As he walked out of the building, flanked by Sarah and the media, Jamal couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Barrett had been the first domino to fall, but now the entire corrupt system was starting to crumble. And Jamal Anderson would be there every step of the way to make sure it did. The courthouse was quiet in the early hours of the morning, the light of dawn just beginning to break through the horizon. Jamal Anderson stood on the courthouse steps, looking out over the city that had become both the backdrop to his greatest victories and his hardest-fought battles. The air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the heat of the courtroom in recent months. Today marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The conspiracy had been exposed, the truth laid bare for the world to see, but the fight for justice was far from over. In the weeks since Jamal had blown the whistle on the corruption that ran deep within the legal system, a whirlwind of events had unfolded. The revelations had sparked a series of investigations, and high-ranking officials were scrambling to save face. Judge Barrett's downfall had been swift, but as Jamal had suspected, he wasn't the only one involved. A network of corrupt judges, lawyers, and politicians had been implicated, and the ripple effect was being felt across the country. Jamal had become something of an unwilling public figure, a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. His face had appeared on news broadcasts, in newspapers, and across social media platforms, as people rallied behind his efforts to expose the truth. But while the attention was overwhelming at times, Jamal remained focused on the task at hand. He hadn't sought out fame or recognition, he had simply wanted to do what was right. As he stood on the courthouse steps, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of pride mixed with a deep exhaustion. The battle against corruption had taken its toll, not just on him, but on those closest to him. Sarah, his loyal colleague, had been by his side through it all, and their bond had only strengthened in the face of adversity. But they both knew that the work they had done was just the beginning. The press conference they had held to expose the conspiracy had been a turning point, not only for the legal system but for Jamal himself. It had been a moment of triumph, but also one of realization. The fight for justice wasn't a single battle, it was a war, one that would require constant vigilance and dedication. The corruption they had uncovered was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and Jamal knew there were still many more pieces to find. He thought back to the cases he had worked on over the years, the countless clients he had defended, and the injustice he had witnessed in the courtroom. As a black lawyer, Jamal had faced subtle racism and bias at every turn. He had seen firsthand how the legal system, which was supposed to be impartial, often worked against people of color. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one crooked politician, it was about a system that had been designed to maintain the status quo, to protect the powerful while marginalizing the vulnerable. But now, standing on the courthouse steps with the morning light casting long shadows across the city, Jamal knew that things were beginning to change. The exposure of the conspiracy had sparked a national conversation about systemic racism in the legal system, and people were finally starting to listen. Protests had erupted in cities across the country demanding reform and accountability. Activists, civil rights groups, and everyday citizens were rallying behind the cause, pushing for change that went beyond superficial fixes. As Jamal watched the sun slowly rise, he felt a sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, it seemed like real progress was within reach. But with that hope came a sober understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. Change wouldn't come easily. Those in power would fight to maintain their grip on the system, and there would be backlash against the reforms that were desperately needed. But Jamal had never been one to back down from a fight. If anything, the events of the past months had only strengthened his resolve. He turned his attention to the courthouse behind him, a symbol of both justice and injustice. It was a place where lives were changed, where decisions were made that could alter the course of a person's future. Jamal had spent years walking through those doors, defending his clients with everything he had. He had seen victories and defeats, moments of triumph and moments of heartbreak. And while the legal system was flawed, he knew that it was also capable of delivering justice if only it was held accountable. As he stood there, lost in thought, a voice broke through the quiet morning air. "Mr. Anderson." Jamal turned to see a young woman approaching him, a nervous smile on her face. She looked to be in her early 20s, with wide eyes that seemed to hold both admiration and uncertainty. He recognized the look he had seen it many times before in young law students or aspiring attorneys who saw him as a role model. "Yes," Jamal said, offering her a warm smile. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to begin. I just wanted to say thank you," she said finally, her voice soft but sincere, "for everything you've done. For standing up for people like me. For fighting for justice when so many others would have stayed silent." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to being thanked for his work. It wasn't why he did what he did. But hearing the gratitude in the young woman's voice reminded him of why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about one case or one victory. It was about the ripple effect that standing up for justice could have on others. "I appreciate that," Jamal said, his voice filled with genuine emotion, "but the fight isn't over. There's still a lot of work to be done." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I know. That's why I'm going to law school. I want to help change the system from the inside, just like you." Jamal's heart swelled with pride. This was what made all the sleepless nights, the stress, and the danger worth it. Knowing that his work had inspired others to join the fight for justice, to challenge the system and demand better, that was the real victory. "You'll make a great lawyer," Jamal said, his smile widening. "And if you ever need any advice, don't hesitate to reach out." The woman beamed, clearly thrilled by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I'll definitely take you up on that." As she walked away, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who believed in fairness, equality, and the idea that the law should work for all people, not just the privileged few. And seeing the next generation of lawyers and activists stepping up to carry the torch gave him hope that the future would be brighter. But even as he basked in that hope, Jamal knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The exposure of the conspiracy had been a major victory, but it had also stirred up a hornet's nest. Powerful people had been implicated, and there were those who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Jamal had received threats, anonymous phone calls, emails, and even veiled warnings from former colleagues, but none of it would deter him. Back in his office later that day, Jamal sat at his desk reviewing the latest developments in the ongoing investigations. His office, once a quiet space where he could focus on his cases, had become a hub of activity. Reporters, activists, and even other lawyers had been reaching out to him, seeking guidance or asking for interviews. It was overwhelming at times, but Jamal knew that this attention was crucial in keeping the momentum going. Sarah entered the office, her expression serious. "We've got another batch of documents to go through," she said, setting a stack of papers on his desk. "More names, more connections. It's even deeper than we thought." Jamal sighed, rubbing his temples. He had known the conspiracy was extensive, but every new revelation seemed to reveal another layer of corruption. "It never ends, does it?" he muttered. Sarah gave him a sympathetic look. "No, but we're making progress. People are starting to listen. The system is being forced to confront its flaws." Jamal nodded, though the weight of the responsibility still pressed heavily on him. "I just hope it's enough. I don't want all of this to be for nothing." "It won't be," Sarah said firmly. You've already changed so much, Jamal. People are paying attention. The legal system is being scrutinized in ways it hasn't been in years. That's because of you." Jamal looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "It's because of us," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Sarah smiled, a rare moment of levity in the midst of their ongoing battle. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. We've still got a lot of work to do." As they continued to review the documents, Jamal's thoughts turned to the future. The legal system, for all its flaws, had the potential to be a force for good. But it would take more than just exposing corruption. It would take systemic change. Laws needed to be rewritten. Judges needed to be held accountable. And the culture of bias and racism needed to be dismantled from the ground up. Jamal knew that he couldn't do it alone, but he also knew that he didn't have to. The events of the past months had shown him that there were people all across the country, lawyers, activists, community leaders who were just as committed to the fight for justice as he was. Together, they could push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Jamal leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. The conspiracy had been exposed, the corrupt had been brought to justice, and the fight for equality was gaining momentum. But the fight was far from over. In the quiet of his office, with the weight of the world still on his shoulders, Jamal Anderson made a silent vow to himself. He would keep fighting. For as long as it took, for as many battles as it required, he would continue to stand up for justice. Because in the end, that was the only way to ensure that the system truly served all people, not just the privileged few. As the final light of day faded, Jamal glanced at the documents spread out before him. The work was daunting, but it was necessary. He smiled to himself, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was never truly over, but with each step forward, they were getting closer. And that, Jamal thought, was worth every battle.